Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. And welcome to this session on wildlife response, which is offered as part of a series of webinars we've been doing on the Tiered Preparedness and Response, or TPR wheel, which, for those that aren't familiar, it's an evolved industry model that really defines the core capabilities that underpin good practice in terms of oil spill preparedness and response. My name is Paul Kelway. I'm the Wildlife Preparedness and Response Manager here at Oil Spill Response, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Hugo Nijkamp, who's the General Manager of Sea Alarm. Sea Alarm are an organization that's been innovating and facilitating preparedness and response to marine wildlife emergencies since 1999. And so really delighted to have Hugo presenting with me alongside Dr. Michael Zaccardi, who's the director of the Old Wildlife Care Network and executive director of the One Health Institute at the University of California, Davis. And Dr. Zaccardi is also the chair of the Global Old Wildlife Response Service, or GOWRS. So in this webinar, we are going to look at wildlife response preparedness good practice. We're going to look at what that means also then in terms of preparedness. How do you actually build that capability and competency over time? And we'll offer a few conclusions as we close and hopefully leave a bit of time for questions as well. So globally speaking, although some countries are well prepared, in general, I think it's fair to say that preparedness for oiled wildlife response does lag behind preparedness for oil spill response. And in general, I think we can see some certain characteristics and some challenges that do arise in relation to wildlife response. One, of course, is that level of preparedness. If the preparedness level is poor, then obviously there's likely to be challenges in terms of mounting an effective response. The number of casualties can be extremely variable and is not necessarily tied to the volume of oil spilled. So we can see small spills that actually have a large impact on wildlife. There are, of course, animal welfare issues, and the legislative context for that, of course, differs country to country. And indeed, there's also humanitarian issues. We need to think about public safety, especially if there's an effort by the public to actually mount their own response, or there's no formal response that's organized. And certainly involving volunteers requires that consideration of public safety as well. And last but not least, wildlife response does garner a really high level of interest from the public. So in terms of media coverage and social media coverage, it really is an activity that's really under the lens, under the spotlight in an incident response. So significantly, all wildlife response was included in this evolved model of the TPR wheel as one of the 15 capability requirements that make up good practice. And there are two freely available documents that were developed really to define that good practice approach. These were published by APICA as part of the post-Macondo Deepwater Horizon joint industry project. And they were both developed by leading old wildlife response experts and organizations. So the first one on the left here is the good practice guide, and it's really about how to prepare. The second was then designed as a technical support document to that really describes the underlying principles of old wildlife response. And that was developed as part of another industry funded project as part of that GIP, which was the Global Old Wildlife Response System, or GOWRS project, and by the partner organizations in that project. So in essence, these documents really help to illustrate what needs to be considered in this particular wedge of the TPR wheel. And we'll look at some of the key aspects of both documents as part of this session. So the definition that's offered by the Good Practice Guide of wildlife response is this. It's that it's the combination of activities that aim to minimize the impacts of an oil spill on wildlife, such as birds, mammals, and reptiles, by both prevention of oiling where possible and mitigating the effects on individuals when oiling has taken place. It's an intentionally broad definition that encompasses a wide range of activities beyond those that we might think of when it comes to wildlife response, from initial preventative measures all the way through to mitigating those impacts on oiled animals. And the key principles document then provides an overview of, firstly, what those effects are, and also some of the strategies that can be employed to respond to those impacts. So Michael Zaccardi, who was actually served as the editor for that key principles document, is going to provide a bit of an overview now of those effects and some of those key principles.
Thank you, Paul. So before we move into actual response, I think it's important to get a shared understanding of the effects of oil on wildlife, because oiling in wildlife can be life or death situations. Now, the impacts can be direct, so direct exposure to the oil, or indirect exposure, either impacts due to a cleanup operation, impacts due to long-term effects within the environment. And those can be both acute as well as chronic. And typically when we talk about the effects of oil on wildlife, we talk about two different types, either external or internal. So the external being from the physical coating. So the effects on the skin, the effects on the feathers or the fur, depending on the animals themselves. And depending on the type of oil, whether it's highly refined, whether it's not, there can be a variety of effects, from skin irritation all the way down to chemical burns. Typically, the largest issue in either feathered animals, birds, or heavily furred mammals is the disruption of waterproofing. And so animals in an aquatic environment use their feathers and fur almost like a dry suit. And so the actual physical coating of oil on that dry suit can create a gap, allowing cold water to seep next to the skin, causing low body temperature and increased metabolic rate, and really leading to very rapid mortality in many situations. Internal effects are usually caused by either inhalation of the fumes or ingestion of the oil itself. And in essence, every organ system in an animal can be affected through internal exposure: the liver, the kidney, reproductive issues, immunosuppression, so the inability to ward off infections, all and such. And so within this document, we tried to take this very complex system of effects and really distill it down into these key areas. The other thing to think about, as I mentioned, direct effects and indirect effects, there are many indirect effects associated with oil spills themselves, some of which disturbance by the cleanup vessels, and others, if controlled burns are utilized, there may be inhalation from smoke, and then obviously exclusion from habitats, especially if those habitats are oiled. Now, when we talk about response strategies, we tend to think about three different types. Primary response strategies, which are really designed to keep oil away from the animals. And so a lot of that is booming, cleanup activities, most of the things that wildlife professionals would not be involved with, but can assist in the planning to try to reduce any impacts due to those primary strategies. They do, however, include reconnaissance, so actually seeing where the animals are as part of the larger oil spill efforts. The next type is a secondary response strategy, and that's really designed to keep animals away from the oil. And so that's either hazing or deterrence, actively scaring animals away from an oil spill habitat, or in very specific incidents, we may actually capture unoiled animals and either hold them for a short period of time until the cleanup is completed, or actually release them at a distance so that they are at less risk of oiling. The third strategy is really only used when the first two are not successful, and that's tertiary response strategies. And those are what we typically think about as a generalized recovery and cleanup of oiled animals. Now, these activities can be broken down into many, many discrete areas. So if we take that wedge of the TPR wheel and break it down, what you see on the screen are many of these activities that can either be within primary, secondary, or tertiary response actions. So those activities can span all the way from the field, as far as survey, reconnaissance, hazing, and capture, all the way to an oiled wildlife facility. So the actual intake, processing, rehabilitation, cleaning, and eventual release of animals during spills. So within this document, what we've tried to do is to really identify the key elements within these to be able to give concrete information for individuals who are interested in doing this to really look at what constitutes international best practice in each of these areas in different chapters of this book. But what we've also done is not only look at the discrete areas and the discrete functions within an oil spill response, is look at some of the overarching principles of oil wildlife response. Those elements that span, no matter if we're talking about primary, secondary, or tertiary actions. Those include, of course, health and safety of responders, triage, or actually looking at animals for prioritization or care, or in many situations, humane euthanasia. Documentation, making sure that what we are doing is being documented fully, and that documentation does enter into whatever incident management system might occur. Looking at those elements that are necessary in facilities, what infrastructure, what basic layout might be best. Looking at communications, and looking at the response team organization. Now, within this response team organization, what we have done is taken kind of at the heart of that TPR wheel, which deals with an effective incident management system. So that is also really a key part of the TPR wheel. And what we've done is broken that down into many different discrete areas. So really one of the keys to a successful wildlife response is good integration within this IMS system that exists. So typically, oiled wildlife response activities are focused in the wildlife branch within the operations section. That's responsible for recovery as well as rehabilitation. But wildlife issues are also represented in the planning section in the environmental unit. So depending on the IMS structure, many of the planning activities do have to occur within this so that wildlife response strategies, tactics, etc., are actually actively part of an incident action plan, as well as ensuring that the communication and understanding of the expectations and the needs of the wildlife responders are integrated into all different elements of the response. To that end, logistics and finance also have a feed into this to make sure that whatever tangible assets are necessary for effective wildlife response are actually available and paid for during that. And so with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Hugo to continue us along the road of the TPR wheel. So Hugo.
Thank you, Mike. Hello, everybody. Yeah, I will take you into the how to implement all of this from an industry perspective. So how do you prepare? And this is what you see here is a gathering of industry subject matter experts that came together in 2019 in Cyprus to discuss how wildlife response could be integrated into the programs of the various industry partners, companies. And this group actually went through all these aspects of wildlife response from a point of view, like how can we do this? What is, from an industry perspective, an important thing to adopt? And through their discussions, they actually concluded that wildlife challenges basically can occur in any oil spill across the world, because if oil is spilled in a marine environment, there are always animals there. And the question is, how many are there and how big will it actually become? They also concluded that an effective response requires that trained local responders are near to the spill, so that can immediately take care of the animals, of the challenges that are evolving, and so can take a lead in collecting animals, etc., while the system could actually mobilize further response capabilities if that would be necessary. But that availability of these first responders, very important. Also, the involvement of various local authorities. You're dealing with wildlife, so there are multiple authorities that you might not see in the wider oil spill response, but that are really particularly important to be involved in a wildlife response. Think about euthanasia, or keeping animals safe from oiling. So the recommendations from this group was that companies should have a good level of preparedness, and basically concentrating, if they have in-country activities, to look at the tier 1 and tier 2 aspects of the response. Where are those responders? How can you actually make sure that those tiers can immediately be available? And also ensure that the support of tier 3 expert organizations from across the world is organized well, so that in bigger challenges you can mobilize them on the spot. But during that workshop, another wheel, I'm afraid, was adopted, and this is actually a summary of what is also written in those guidelines. It is how you actually build up your preparedness. And if you look at this wheel, you can see a purple part and a green part, and I will explain shortly what that means. Basically, the purple part is the startup phase, where you actually consider, do I have wildlife risks? And if I have them, what would I like to do about it? So if you make that assessment, which basically is to look into your in-country activities and the environment where you are operating, to see if there might be big wildlife challenges that you might risk. And so your rationale and objectives actually indicate that you want to do something about it. That should lead in some scenarios that you would run, and just to see what kind of expectations you might have with those wildlife challenges, and turn that into some strategies. How are you going to do that? So basically what you're doing in that purple part is to develop a response plan, overseeing not only those challenges, but also to see who in country could be activated and being, involved in that process. And so that planning would result in a wildlife response plan, where you identify how you would respond, how you would actually set up your response system, which kind of functions you would have in that system, and how the roles and responsibilities would pan out. So that is actually what you are doing in that first phase. Once that plan has been developed and has been put on the table, it is actually to implement that plan, and that is what that green part of the circle is doing. You engage with the resources that you may have identified, and you want to involve them. So if there are NGOs or authorities that you've identified in the plan, you want to make sure that they understand the plan and also accept that they could play a role, and so you're engaging with it. So it's the resourcing of people, but also the equipment and perhaps the facilities that you would need in a wider response. So that resourcing is very important. After which you can start working with those resources, and that comes to equipment, stockpiling, inspections, etc., using that equipment in training, but also in exercises. So that is an ongoing process, and I will go into detail in the next few slides. But the idea is that you continue to do these activities over the years. It's a multi-year investment in which you gradually work up these resources so that they are better prepared to deal with these incidents. And continuous improvement means that at the end of every year or every second year, you would evaluate where are we, what did we do, where are the gaps, are there new insights, and that could actually lead into revisiting the purple part of the wheel just to see if anything needs to be changed. If not, you continue. And so this is a turning wheel. That is how it is set up. The resourcing is really important because if you look at the tiered response preparedness wheel, it suggests that maybe with a tier 3 component, you're already fine. So if you have any group of international responders, you can just go to sleep and not worry. That is not the case. You actually have to invest into those tiers responders. And probably in the location where you might risk your spills, there might not be a lot of responders. But if you look further to a national level or regional level, there are many more resources that you could identify. That is basically the biggest chunk of people and equipment that you might want to source. So that green box has been put in this graph as the largest that need that investment. And then the tier 3 responders that you have identified globally, they are topping that up. So they bring in expertise, also a bit of equipment, but they don't make the show on the day. It's those other boxes. So that is what also the Cyprus workshop identified. So if you want to do training, training needs also to be more or less standardized. So there's a lot of training courses that can be looked at. So on the right side, you see the organization model, all kind of functions that you might need, hands-on functions that people really working with the animals, and everybody needs to do a bit of the total pie. And you would divide that up into simple routines for maybe the convergent volunteers towards the managers that are sitting on top to lead all these activities. And all these people need to be trained. So it is important to train people on international good standards of good practice. And that is where you can also tap into the global tier 3 responders experience and expertise so that these can provide that training on a regular basis for you and for your tier 1 and 2 responders. So it's important that that is an ongoing thing. While people are trained, exercises are having multiple functions. Often it's an eye-opener, and it's also often a very essential bit of getting people really prepared, because in an exercise they can see the full scale of things. And as you may know, there are multiple ways of providing exercises. It goes from seminars and workshops and tabletops towards drills and functional exercises, or even full-scale exercises. And the more you get there, the more people and the more equipment you would put into the exercise. So things get a bit more expensive, but you can also do it on any smaller scale. And so exercise is really important, as we know from other parts of oil spill response, and that goes for the wildlife response as well. The continuous improvement is your roadmap. You know where you want to go. You have targeted some basic preparedness that you want to achieve, or you have defined it for your long-term goal. And every now and then you have to evaluate where are you and where does this roadmap lead you. And so that is a multi-year and a multi-stakeholder journey. And that needs also good management to make sure that you keep on track and things are moving on. So that's for me. Over back to Paul.
Thank you very much, Hugo, and thank you, Mike. Just to build on that, Hugo's touched quite a bit on the relationship between the tiers of response. And if we look at tiered capability, it's really important to consider how tier 3 or international resources can actually support not just response, but also that preparedness journey. And certainly over the last 10, 20 years, there's been efforts to really enhance the tier 3 resources that are available. And some of these listed here are those that are available through OSRL services to members. And that includes technical advice from Sea Alarm. It now includes access to an old wildlife assessment team from GOWRS. So that's a 4-person assessment team delivered by a network of leading wildlife response organizations. And that was an outcome of that GOWRS project. And also access to these tier 3 wildlife equipment stockpiles as well. But it is essential, as Hugo said, to really think of these tier 3 services as a complement to and not a substitute for developing that in-country capability. And in fact, they can provide that vital support on the journey, really helping to facilitate and enable in-country preparedness and really improve that capability over time. And as we said at the beginning, for old wildlife response, the reality is that in many locations, the in-country resources may be absent, or they may not be formally connected into the oil spill response structures. And in those cases, tier 3 experts can help to determine what may be feasible in a response. And also to support preparedness efforts over time that really allows that capability within country at a tier 2 and also tier 1 level to be there, and ultimately over time allowing for that more complete picture of tiered capability, which will look different, but ultimately is designed for a particular operational location. So in conclusion, old wildlife response is absolutely integral to oil spill response preparedness. And so it's a fantastic development that it is now recognized as part of that new evolved TPR wheel and as part of good practice in terms of oil spill preparedness and response. It can be underestimated in terms of the complexity and the resource requirements. And it's because of that it's really key to consider and to prepare ahead of time. And as was mentioned, that preparedness is a multi-year journey. It involves those investments and those activities year on year that really develop that plan and implement through training, equipment, exercises, and certainly with the intention to involve all key stakeholders in that. So that is a whistle-stop tour, let's say, of good practice in relation to wildlife response. I would certainly recommend, if you haven't already, get hold of the IPCA good practice documents that are freely available to download from the IPCA website. And certainly you're welcome to follow up if you have any further questions. But for now, I would like to thank my co-presenters, Michael Siccardi and Hugo Nijkamp. Thank you very much for lending your expertise and knowledge to this. And to thank you all for attending. And hopefully we have just a few minutes here. If you do have any questions, you're very welcome to just post those in the chat. We'll just take a few minutes here in case there are any questions that anybody has. And then we'll close. While you are thinking about questions, I'll just mention that the next in this series of seminars related to the TPR wheel is on the 21st of November, and that will be looking at economic assessment and compensation. So hopefully you'll join us for that. And just a reminder that everybody that is registered will get access to the recordings of this webinar and also the others in the series. So with that, Mike, Hugo, I'll ask you maybe just to put your cameras on and we'll just see if anybody has any questions that they would like to throw in here. Great. So one from Dario. Thank you for an excellent presentation. What advances have been made in cleaning products for old animals? Mike, do you want to take that one?
Sure. It is a question that comes up at every spill incident. There have been a number of products that continue to be looked at, some newer, some older. I think all of the research currently still indicates that liquid dishwashing Detergents are still the best means to clean animals. Those different types of products, there is some slight variability amongst them, but as far as comparing that to some of the newer cleaning technologies, etc., still basically a liquid dishwashing detergent manually agitated around feathers or fur still ends up being the best.
Great, thank you, Mike. There is a question here about getting access to the recordings. So yeah, just to say again that you will receive an email with a link to access the recordings from this and the other sessions as well. Hugo, I might just ask you one question here while we're just giving people a bit of more time about exercises. I'm just wondering if you've got any sort of recommendations there around, if you're looking to exercise in a country or location where the preparedness is not well developed. You talked about progressing those types of exercises over time, but what in your experience have been really valuable ways to sort of bring stakeholders together in the first place to almost get the conversation going and really look and hopefully develop preparedness based on their experience or their better understanding of the risk?
Yeah, what my experience is what I've been involved in many times is to bring stakeholders together in a workshop, and that is a perfect opportunity where you can do a tabletop, and the more attractive you make that, the more inspired people get. It's often that they don't realize what a wildlife response could bring. People think about a single bird, a single duck, and they think, well, what's all the fuzz of that? And but they don't realize that it is a geographically and also quantitatively a very complicated process. And you can visualize that by tabletops. Put a map on the table, let that spill happen, and ask people of different responsibilities. What are you going to do because you would have authorities, for instance, around the table that have a responsibility for combating the oil spill. So on that scenario, you can just say, what would you do in the first hours? And imagine that now animals are arriving. Who can do something? How do you organize that? That is often a very useful discussion. So a tabletop is often a great way into it, but you have to make it attractive.
Yeah, thank you, Hugo. No, some really good points there. Certainly one that we want to encourage more of is those sort of engagements and stakeholder workshops. Mike, just to close here, there was a question about advances in cleaning products, but just to expand that, obviously World Wildlife Response has come a long way over the last few decades, certainly in terms of the preparedness in California, for example. But what do you see as probably one of the most significant advances in a way in terms of how we respond?
I think two answers come to mind on that. First is that I think the knowledge of how oil or petroleum can affect wildlife, I think advances in the research and the knowledge since Macondo have really helped us to better understand the more subtle chronic effects, especially some of the issues related to bottlenose dolphins that occur in the Gulf of Mexico has really kind of opened our eyes to some of those chronic long-term potentials that we suspected before, but really didn't have concrete evidence. What that has really helped us do from a preparedness and a response side is really emphasize the fact of adequate readiness. The quicker we can respond and the more effective that response is as far as being integrated into the overall spill response structure is going to get animals out of the environment and starting into a rehabilitative process. And so yes, there's advances, medical advances as far as treatment, et cetera, but really what what has become clearer and clearer is the more ready we are and the sooner we can respond, the better the outcome is going to be for wildlife that are impacted.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, very well said. Yeah, some really great developments there. And I think with that, we are a little bit over time. I would just say, if you do have any further questions, you are welcome to email me on the address here. So I think maybe that's the best way of dealing with any further questions that anyone has. But for now, just again to thank you all for attending, and Hugo, Mike, thank you very much for presenting today. Thanks very much, everyone.
You're welcome.